Hello, I'm Dr. Josie Barnard, Subject Head of Creative Writing here at De Montfort University. I'm delighted to be here to introduce our Leicester Centre for Creative Writing publishing event. Our distinguished guests, Margaret Busby, who co-founded Allison Busby Publishing House in 1967, Farhana Shaikh, who founded Dahlia Books here in Leicester in 2010, Kimberley Redway, who's a creative writing graduate from De Montfort University, who's been published by Bloomsbury and has also self-published books to support the writing community. But I'm going to start with Margaret. Hi. So Margaret, very, very glad to have you here. Thank you for being with us. In the 1960s, when you co-founded Allison and Busby, publishing was dominated very much by the big five. There were HarperCollins, that dated back to 1817, Hachette dated back to 1826, Macmillan to 1843, Simon & Schuster to 1824, and Penguin had been founded in 1935. So it was a pretty formidable landscape that you were entering. And in your introduction to the book, New Daughters of Africa, you say, now, as in past decades, the nature of publishing has a bearing on what reaches the marketplace. And then in 1969, Allison Busby defied all odds by turning Sam Greenlee's subversive first novel, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, into a publishing success. Can you tell us about what it felt like to be starting a publishing house? Why did you decide to take on this challenge?
Well, I suppose I have to go back to the fact that I was young. I was actually still at university when I met Clive Allison, who was also at university. And we met at a party. A friend of mine was actually having her first novel published and was about to get married to somebody who was at university with Clive Allison at Oxford. And so we were invited to the party and we were chatting about what we might do when we left university. Because we've been introduced, because we were both doing things to do with poetry and our literary magazines at our respective colleges. And so we said, well, I thought I might get into publishing. Well, so did I. Why don't we start a publishing company? So that's how it originated. We certainly knew nothing about the logistics of doing it. We just had ideals and we were too young to know what we were getting into. So that was how it started. We met up again after we graduated and we went full steam ahead trying to do what we believed in, not knowing what the conventions were. And I think that was one of the values, that we were too young to know any better. So we decided we wanted to publish poetry books, and that because we were young and we couldn't afford necessarily the expensive, slim, hardback volumes that poetry normally came in, we were going to do cheap paperbacks. So we, used an electric typewriter to print them. We didn't know how many copies to print. We said, okay, millions of people in the country, let's have 15,000. So we had 15,000 5-shilling poetry books and no distribution or we didn't know what we were doing. So that's where we started. And I think we started that way because we saw things that were not being done that we wanted to do for ourselves and other people like ourselves. And that was the spirit behind Allison Busby all along. I mean, in the same way as when we published The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which was our first novel in 1969, it had been turned down by 40 or more publishers on both sides of the Atlantic. And I was introduced to the author because he had met a friend of my my husband, who was not Clive Allison, actually. I was married to a jazz musician who was nothing to do with publishing. And so I met Sam Greenlee and we decided this was going to be our first full-time novel. And one of the things that I saw going through my schooling and my university education is that there were so few books by people that I could relate to, identify with. I didn't read a single book by a Black writer in my whole school or university curriculum, if you can imagine that. So it was only the only books I read were books I sourced myself outside my official, if you like, education. So I would seek out books in some of the educational publishers like Heinemann, Longman, Macmillan's. They were publishing for the educational market in the colonies, if you like. So most of the books they were publishing were not for the trade press. Or sometimes I would find books published in America that I found in secondhand bookshops or whatever, and they were not being published for the British market. They might be, in those days, you would get collections of poetry for by the Negro, as we were called in those days. So I was finding the things I wanted to read not in local bookshops in Britain. So that was, even without knowing it, that was the spirit behind the things we took on at Allison Busby, doing things that were not being done in ways that were not being done by people who we thought had things worthwhile reading, things that needed to be said.
I mean, I think one of the things that's really striking about your description is how dynamic it sounds. There's a real image of publishing houses being places where authors come to the publishing house with their manuscript. Sylvia Townsend gives a wonderful description in the preface to one of her novels of carrying her manuscript, her typescript, bound, tied up in a ribbon on the bus to Chester and Windus. But of course, you were a brand new publishing house. Authors weren't necessarily coming to you. And so what we're hearing is you going out and really having to search and scour. And then, of course, there's the wonderful 5 shippings. This takes us back to a very different time of pricing and cost. Can you talk us through some of the practicalities of publishing a book? There's a great picture in The Guardian of you and Clive Allison over a pint of beer, looking very much as if that's where you started your publishing house.
Actually, we found one of our authors in the local pub. I mean, we found authors where we could, and sometimes authors did come to us. In fact, because we got a lot of publicity. I mean, I remember we had a lunch with Spike Milligan, who was a huge comedian who wanted to see whether we might do his book. In fact, at another point, we had a visit from I didn't see her, but Clive Allison went to see an American film actress called Gloria Swanson. So we had a high profile because we were doing such extraordinary things, but we did everything ourselves. This is The Spook Who Sat by the Door, the first book, first novel we published. I did the jacket myself with Leicester. I wrote the blurb myself. I edited it. We did everything ourselves. I got some quotes from authors for the back. So we were doing everything that that had to be done ourselves, and we didn't know what we were doing, but we had a lot of enthusiasm and energy. So when people said, "Oh, things couldn't be done," we didn't know that they couldn't be done. In fact, another story about Spook is that we thought, when it was in manuscript, we thought, well, this is a really interesting, dynamic political thriller which ought to be serialized in the national newspapers. So we sent the manuscript to the Observer saying, would you like to serialize this book we're about to publish? Now, they sent it back saying, well, you ought to know we don't serialize fiction, and if we did, it wouldn't be a Black Power first novel like this. Now, not knowing any better, we sent it back to the Observer, and a dynamic person there decided, yes, we'll do it. So they did extracts from Spook in the Observer magazine when it was published in March 1969. So that was not knowing the conventions, so we could then defy the conventions, and sometimes things worked. In fact, one of the things about the 60s was that everything seemed possible when you were young. All the people who started publishing companies after we did, I'm sure they looked at us and thought, well, if those 2 young people can do it without money or experience, then it can be done. So that was something that happened. Now, I'll tell you another thing about the 60s. I identify the 60s as the first time I could buy clothes that fitted me in shops, because I'm the same size as I've always been since I was 15. 5'2". So I used to have to buy my clothes in the children's department because they did not make clothes for adults in small sizes until the 60s. So the 6 was identified with being able to buy clothes in size 10 or size 8 or whatever, because previously it was children's department or size 12. So things started to change in the 60s, and the publishing industry, I think, took a cue from that. And that was when we began, in the spirit we began, where things were, we would walk down King's Road and stop people in the street saying, do you want to buy a book? Because we had no distribution.
Well,
So
I was going to ask you about the distribution, actually, because distribution is notoriously challenging for independent presses. So getting the authors producing a beautiful book, as you've shown with your copy of Spooks, and that is all doable. It's all affordable, but distribution. So how did you tackle distribution?
Well, in the first stages, we didn't have any, which is why we had to stop people in the streets with the poetry books and knock on doors. But then we got a break because Andre Deutsch, who we'd met at the Frankfurt Book Fair, I think, and he decided he would do us a favor. He said he'd do us one favor, and that favor was to take on distributing our books. So that, we did a deal with him. That's how we began to be distributed in a traditional way. We ended up having freelance salespeople, freelance reps, and it went on from there. We began doing what had to be done in publishing terms and having salespeople going around selling the books, visiting the bookshops, getting orders. So all of that had to be done. It still has to be done, but there are different ways of doing things now, of course, as we know, because we didn't have the internet in those days. So things have changed. Some things may be easier, but I think one of the things that is always necessary is to have that enthusiasm, that feeling that things can be done for the first time, even if you don't know you're doing it the first time. You're doing it just because you believe in it.
Fantastic. And one thing I do want to just kind of drill down into a little bit before we move on to Farhana, is the practicalities of it, because as you say, everything has been transformed as a result of the internet, and digital has changed everything. So we're talking very much what would have been called what is now called the traditional publishing model, whereby the book comes in as a pile of papers, and in some of the bigger publishers, what unsolicited manuscripts would be piled up in what was called the slush pile, kind of very alarmingly for authors, I think. And then that slush pile would be gone through by readers, by editors, or the authors would be spoken to. And could you talk us through that process, that, as I say, quote unquote, traditional publishing model, from the point of manuscripts coming in to going out and being in people's hands? And I love the fact that you were literally putting them in people's hands in the street.
Well, as I said, when we began Allison Busby, it was a small company. There was Clive Allison and myself. We also had a friend called Graham Huntley, who conveniently had a flat in Soho, which doubled as our office. So we had few personnel. We took on one or two more people along the way. In fact, one of the people who became my assistant, when the first time I could have an editorial assistant, was a wonderful woman who is now a well-known writer called Lavinia Greenall. And Lavinia we gave her first job. She was my editorial assistant. So up until quite late in our careers as publishers, we didn't have a huge staff, so we had to do everything. So Clive was the publicist, if you like. So we had the slush pile to go through. We read things. We publicized books however we could. We took people out to lunch. I was the editor. Clive was more the front man. We also, at a later stage, had a wonderful salesperson called Bill Swainson, who went on to do other sorts of publishing with Bloomsbury, with Canongate, and so on. So we were lucky that we found lots of people who came through our doors who got some grounding in publishing through us, but not necessarily traditional. In fact, I'm always amused by the fact there's a novelist called Maggie G, who met us, and she's always reminding me that Allison Busby was the first publisher she'd met. And so she thought all publishers were like Allison Busby, which was not far from the truth. So we were not doing, although you say it was traditional publishing, we were doing things in a very untraditional way mostly. So, sometimes we thought, well, we had to publish books because publishing, you obviously, to survive, you have to have some sort of business sense. You have to make enough money to keep publishing the things you believe in. And every so often we think, well, we ought to try and publish things that will make us some money, because we didn't have that much money. We borrowed money from friends. One or two wonderful friends invested in us a few £100 here and there. And so people will say, well, books about animals sell. So we published a wonderful book by a Dutch writer on rats. We were just being mavericks. In fact, somebody once said to me, which I took as a great compliment, you never knew what Allison Busby was going to do next, but you knew it was going to be interesting. So, we didn't do just cuddly animal books about cats and dogs. We did books about rats. we were just being defiant, if you like. We were bucking the traditional model of publishing and doing things that we wanted to do, that we thought people might be interested in reading. So it was traditional but untraditional compared to what's happening now.
That's fantastic. I suppose when I said traditional, I kind of more meant traditional literally in terms of the publishing process of getting the book and having to fix typesetting, because of course now we've got ebooks, we've got you've got a whole bunch of different ways that you can read fiction, non-fiction, there's flash fiction, so it's now the ways in which people can engage with literature have proliferated. So I'm now going to turn to Farhana, who in a way has really bridged that, because you founded Dahlia Books in 2010, and so obviously you've had to deal with both. The digital turn has really affected you in a very direct way. So Farhana, could you talk us through a kind of your route in? So we've heard Margaret's absolutely magnificent story about how she co-founded Allison Busby. How did you found Dahlia?
So Dahlia really came about because for 3 years prior I'd been running something called the Asian Writer, which was my way of showcasing and profiling South Asian writers, people who looked like me and who I never really got to see on the pages of The Guardian and things that I was reading at the time. But actually what came out of that, running an online blog, was a sense of community. And I'm in Leicester, so it's very isolating. It's far removed from the publishing world as possible. And I think I just felt like it was kind of reassuring that there were other people who felt very similar to me, that there wasn't a space for us to really showcase our stories. And there was a lot of frustration, if I'm honest, within that online community about the sort of gatekeeping that happens in publishing, and the challenges they were facing made me think, well, if the bigger publishers aren't going to take them on, there's talent here, and I'm going to do it myself. I had a degree in publishing and English from, way back when I was studying at Loughborough. So I kind of knew some things. I didn't go in it completely blind, as Margaret was saying. I kind of knew publishing, or I thought I knew publishing before I started Dahlia. And it was just a sort of, it really came from listening to people, airing their frustrations, and then thinking, why not?
Brilliant. And so when you decided why not, and you've got, as you say, you did a publishing MA, so you have some knowledge of the publishing model, whether presumably you had knowledge of the quote unquote traditional publishing model, as well as the you'd already started thinking about digital publishing. You'd already been doing digital publishing via your blog. Can you talk us through the first publications? There's the point when you decided to found a publisher, then there's the point when your first book or books come out.
Yeah, okay. So that was quite quick. I would say. And that was because I'd already tapped into a community from the Asian writer. And what I decided was just to do a test publication. So we launched in September 2010, I think. It's a long time ago. Struggling with days. And I'd already previously had a sort of call out through the Asian writer saying that we're going to celebrate 3 years in October and we're going to produce an anthology. And when I think about it, in many ways, it's very similar to Margaret. You know, I had really no idea. There might have been the BA that I did, but I had really no, managing relationships with authors, contractual side, things like that. Didn't really have an understanding of that. But what I guess I did have was the support of an online community, which I'd nurtured and supported for 3 years. And then when it came to this call out and this anthology, all the kind of work that I'd done building up this community meant that, and it seems really strange now to think about it, like, we've in Happy Birthday to Me, which was the very first publication of Dahlia's, there's, voices now which are so prominent, like Nikesh Shukla, Niven Govindan. Rupa Faruqi was already published and I'd interviewed her. She was one of my very first authors that I'd interviewed on The Asian Writer, and she's got a poem published in that anthology. So yeah, it seems really, really exciting now, knowing where their journeys have gone on since.
And what about some of the practicalities? I keep coming back to distribution, I suppose, because actually getting the book into the hands of the reader is such a crucial part of publishing. What was the journey of that first publication from submission to reader?
Yeah, I think obviously one of the benefits we had starting a press in the noughties was the access to digital and short print runs. So we really, and that's the sort of model that I still use today, we really do very short print runs and test the market. But I think we've also been able to cultivate very niche audiences and kind of bypass maybe traditional lines of distribution. Obviously, social media is quite a big thing for us. We're constantly engaging with our readers on there, and I think online networks has helped us have conversations with readers where we don't necessarily it's not a case that we don't need bookshops, but we can also bypass them and have kind of very immediate conversations with readers through newsletters, through our social media channels, and also our events that we do.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because WH Smith famously is a bit of a kind of barrier in a way, because if the independent presses can't get their books into WH Smith, they can't get them into the hands of the readers. But it sounds as if you've been able to bypass all sorts of those traditional routes extremely effectively. It would be also great to hear a bit about how Dahlia has grown. You've wonderfully been awarded Arts Council funding very recently. Many publishers do start in a kitchen or in a pub. Could you talk us through that route from? I mean, in a way, it's a moot point whether the start is the start of the Asian Writer blog or the start of Dahlia. But from what you see as the start to where we are now.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think I have kind of interesting ideas and thoughts about growth. So for me, the beauty of the small presses are that they are small and manageable, and therefore can be done in the way that I do. So we had, in that first year, we published 1 book. We only really still publish between 2 and 4 books each year. So we're still very small. But I think there's a really beautiful aspect of that, in the sense that you're doing something that you're not looking to kind of follow the market. You're only getting books that and publishing books that you're really passionate about and you really believe in, which I think is very important for our kind of ethos, and it speaks to our ethos and values. But also, I think, I mean, just this year alone, it is quite overwhelming and challenging to do everything yourself. So not only have we been awarded Arts Council funding this year, but we've also been shortlisted for the Small Press of the Year, and we're a regional finalist for that for the Midlands. So I think in terms of where the growth has happened, it's just a building of reputation and people trust you more over time. And, you know, if you keep doing the same thing consistently, whether you do it well or otherwise, you know, that's for others to judge. I think what you do get and bring about is this community. And I think that's what really, for me, I'm a writer myself, and I think that's really lacking in spaces like the Midlands. So I always feel like that the events and I know obviously we've had a pandemic and we've not had physical events, but we've done online events. So we're constantly trying to cultivate a space for people to gather and share ideas, whether it's about motherhood, whether it's about our place as, you know, Muslim women or whatever it is. And I feel like we're still living in a time when those conversations and those spaces don't exist, which is when you start opening them up, people sort of come together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a community of writers, a community of thinkers, is really, really important, and leads very directly to Kimberly. So, Kimberly, you are a published novelist, and you've got, as well as the young adult Misfit, which came out in 2018, you've got a new novel coming out this year. And I've mentioned already 2 initiatives, publishing initiatives. So one is the Gentleman's Press. One is the Gentleman's Press, and one is Coquettish Professionals. And they were published in 2012 by you and 2015, explicitly to promote the work of young writers and artists, encouraging the next generation to create. So I think that you have been really directly inspired and motivated by this wish to have a community of writers, and so I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, about what motivates you to write and to be a publisher.
Okay, because I owe a lot to doing me. I just want to say that firstly, because I remember being at an event where we had to do our final piece. We had to create a published work, and I looked at the table of all the different published works that were around me, and I thought to myself, I'd love to see all of these on bookshelves. You know, how can you make that happen? So I went on a bit of a journey, just, you know, meeting different people. And I actually met 9 Archers. I was introduced to them. They're in the Midlands, and they create books. And they mentored me, and they sent me lengthy emails about how to publish work and how to do print runs and how to get editors. And I learned a lot from them. So through the whole journey, I've just been meeting lots of different people and trying to create that community around me. And I owe a lot to social media as well. That's how I meet a lot of creatives. So if I want to find a graphic designer, I can just type that into Twitter. And if they're nearby me, I can just approach them and say, are you interested in creating a cover? And what I really like about that is that creative control as well, being able to say, you know, I would like it to have it this way, because when it comes to objection to perfection, I wasn't particularly happy with the first cover. So I expressed that to the artist, and we kind of had a dialogue, and then that created the cover that you can see now. And I love how passionate and vivid it is. So that's what I like the most about working closely with different creatives and meeting new people.
And one of the things you've really drawn attention to is the difference between the hard copy and the digital version, so that when you were in your third year course, which is currently called professional writing, you and your peers actually made books. You sat down and you made books, and it was seeing those artifacts, those objects, which are so beautiful, with the covers, with the paper. It's so tactile, and that inspired you, the actual objects. Well, of course, when you're digital, it's you've still got fonts, you've still got margins to think about, you've still got covers, but it's all digital, it's all remote. So could you talk, I mean, what could you give us a couple of thoughts on the differences between the two ways of getting reading material out to people?
See, just listening to Margaret talk about how she had to do it in the past, I think we're quite pampered now, because the way we can put work out, you can just publish something on a blog within minutes. So it is about being more innovative, thinking of how, because we can easily get distracted by other forms of entertainment as opposed to just reading. So for me, in the past, 2010, I was very much about traditional. I wanted to see published works. I didn't like Kindles. I didn't like ebooks. So that's why those were printed copies. I actually have a blog post talking about that, about how some people really just don't want to involve themselves with ebooks. But now I'm a lot more digital. I read on my phone. I read on my Kindle that I have now, because I just don't have space for books. In my room, I have too many books. And I think it is also, it's a bit more sustainable as well, just with paper recycling, and you want to keep that. So you're talking to someone who's a bit more reformed, but so we are pampered. We can, as I said, you can reach out to people who are creative all over the place just by using social media and websites and things. So that's how I did it.
Yeah, and I think social media is really important as well, because that is a direct line to readers, But I think that what this leads us to very, very neatly is our first question that's open for everyone, which is, why is publishing important? I mean, Margaret, could we start with you on that one? Why is publishing important? It's a big, big question.
Sorry, I wasn't muted. No, it's a huge question. I think publishing is certainly important. And we talked about the community of writers. It takes me back to when I started in the 60s. There was a community of publishers, if you like, because although I was the first Black woman publisher, when I published those books in 1967, in 1966, there was a company called New Beacon Books, founded by John LaRose. It actually was the first Black publishing company in this country. And then in 1969, another company called Bogle Louverture, started by Jessica Huntley and her husband, Eric Huntley, started publishing. The first book they published was by Walter Rodney. So there were pioneering Black publishers like that. And also, again, in 1987, Verna Wilkins started Tamarind Books, which is specifically children's books. But when we were talking about distribution, these are all publishers who didn't necessarily rely on getting books into W.H. Smith, but actually went to where the potential audience was, whether it was meetings, events. I know Verna talked about going to Black hair fairs to find people who might buy those books. So, and also an important venture that happened between, from the early 80s to the mid-90s was the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, which brought together over a period of about a week, with a festival as well as a book fair, writers, publishers, readers from all the continents, but specifically with a focus on Black literature. So that was a place where you were able to see what was being published. And as publishers, we shared a lot of the information we had. We used the same printer, for example, who was good in terms of giving us credit. We used the same, sometimes, cover designer or cover artist. Errol Lloyd was one who was in common with Bogle Louverture, New Beacon Books, and Allison Busby. So we were trying to do things that raised the profile of the literature throughout the country. And it also happened in terms of magazines. A magazine called Wasafiri, which is still going, it was founded by Sushila Nasta, was putting out international literature. So we were trying to change the landscape. And I think that's why publishing is important, because it's, in fact, there's a quote I'll give you that I interviewed Toni Morrison in 1988, which was when she wasn't as famous as she is now. In fact, I'll tell you another story, because she was over here to for the publication of Beloved in 1988, early 1988. And I think there was a television program was going to have Toni on and me on talking about publishing or editing, because Toni was an editor. And at the last minute, the program dropped the item. And I think I spoke to a researcher who said she thought it was because Toni wasn't well enough known. And so we're talking about 1988. And so there was a young filmmaker called Sindamli Bridgelil who, with me and Toni, we decided we're going to make our own film. And Toni had an hour free in her schedule, so I didn't have time to reread the books. I did a televised interview with Toni Morrison. And the next month, Toni won the Pulitzer Prize. And we sold the film actually to Channel 4. And she won the Nobel Prize in 1993. So that's how recent the attention given to her was. But I remember in that interview, I'm trying to think what the quote was, because, yes, she said one of the things we were talking about was exactly this thing of why is publishing important. And she was at that time an editor with Random House. And we talked about the fact that she knew when she was publishing a Black writer that she had to make sure that writer succeeded. Otherwise, the impression might be that all Black writers don't sell. And we were talking about why it's important to have a diverse publishing industry, if you like. And one of the things that was happening in the 80s, that I was involved with a group of people with an initiative called GAP, which stood for Greater Access to Publishing, which was trying to get more diversity into the publishing publishing industry, if you like, in this country. And we wrote an article, I've got it here, was published in the Bookseller in 1988. And it starts with a quote from Toni Morrison that says, "It's not patronage, it's not affirmative action we're talking about here. We're talking about the life of a country's literature." And I think that's what it is. It's not that doing anybody a special favor, it's just making the whole literary effort more rich. And that's the aim of publishing. That's the aim of that's why publishing is important, because we're reaching out, we're enriching literature. We're not putting it into some straitjacket saying literature can only be like this. So this is what normal literature should be like, and anything else is some sort of special favor to everybody else. So publishing is important because it helps get the word out there, helps make wonderful literature accessible to as many people as possible. Publishing means making public. Brilliant. So if you believe in something, you want to make it public. If you believe in it, tell people about it. Say, read this book.
And Farhana, what for you, why is publishing important?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't help but laugh when Margaret said about the efforts being made to diversify the industry, and here we still are. So yeah, publishing is important because, as Margaret said, it's, you know, you're making something public. But more so than that, I think, you know, we've been living in such toxic times of late, and stories matter. Stories change the world, and the more we can help to bring about diverse work, diverse stories, stories from as many different voices as possible within those diverse diversities, if you like, means that we see ourselves differently as well. Like, you know, if you're not represented, you can't, if a young person can't see themselves as something because that story's never been told, how can they have different possibilities for themselves, different ambitions? So I think that in a way, publishing is important because stories matter. And at the end of the day, you know, story is everything. We know that.
And Kimberly, for you, why is publishing important?
I was speaking to someone about maybe doing content writing, and he reminded me, well, he diagnosed me with imposter syndrome, but he reminded me that writing is a kind of superpower, that not everyone can do it. Maybe not everybody wants to do it, but there's a certain kind of human telepathy to it. You can sit there and become immersed in a world that someone else has created, and just there's such a power to reading, and you can spread ideas and influence other people as well as entertaining them and exciting them. And that's something that not everything can do. So that's why I think it's important to just put things out there and do that.
And it's wonderful to think of it as a superpower. And we're going to move on. I'm aware we've got so much to fit in, wonderful speakers, and of course also the wonderful book extracts coming up. So the next question, keep the answers a little bit tight and punchy, because I think we're going to come back to be able to discuss all of this at the end, I hope, if we have time and if everybody else has time. But so the next question is about the challenges and possibilities for publishing now. Oh, sorry, I've jumped straight to the future. Let's go straight to the future and forget now. Let's go to the challenges and possibilities for publishing in the future. And Margaret.
Well, I think you should go to the younger people, actually, because I'm the past, aren't I? No, I think the point is publishing should include everyone. We're not just talking about ethnicity. We're talking about age. We're talking about class. We're talking about everything. Why should the publishing industry only have a certain profile? I think it's important for the future that publishing is just something that is part of everybody's lives. And publishing itself has many departments. And we're not just talking about the editorial department, there's the rights department, the sales department. So there are so many things that could involve many more people. And I hope in the future that publishing will just have a different profile, that anybody thinks I could be in publishing. It's not that I'm the wrong class or the wrong age or the wrong ethnicity. I could be in publishing.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think we're actually going to come to that question in a moment, and I'm going to ask you all. But firstly, if we could go to Farhana and then Kimberly for what are the key challenges and possibilities for publishing in the future, in your view? What do you think jumps out, Farhana?
Well, I think one of the things is that we are facing a real possibility of, can we survive as an industry? And that's not only the small presses, given the pandemic and all that, the challenges that we've faced, very real challenges that we've faced, but also publishing and its relevance. If it doesn't change, if it doesn't embrace diversity, I'm not going to hold back when I say that publishing is still primarily very white, very middle class, and it has a lot to do. So I think there's a real possibility that publishing will become irrelevant. And we're seeing that already when you see people engaging more with different media. Gaming is huge because it doesn't have the sort of elitist attitudes that I think publishing still does, and it holds the industry back.
I mean, I think, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think one of the things you raised there, a couple of things have come up, and Margaret mentioned rights and, of course, ethics and social media. So when you start bringing all those things into the mix, actually, it's going to be really interesting to think about how you even define publishing going forwards. So, yeah, really interesting. And Kimberly, what are the key challenges and possibilities for publishing in the future for you?
I think it could be a bit more positive. I think that we could have a lot more unique storytelling. I know that on the internet, there's little pockets of communities jumping up, like, the body positive movement. And we have something called the femininity movement as well. It's on YouTube. I don't know if anyone knows about that. But and I think we'll be able to learn a lot more about what people want to read. But it could possibly become a bit more formulaic if we just decide to start thinking, what do people want to read? We have to still think about the art of it and wanting to express ourselves and tell the truth. I remember, I don't know if everyone remembers Twilight. That book did get people to read, and I know that people do judge it and think it's not very good, but it did get people to read other books as well. So I think that that's something that does help the industry, even if people don't like it. So that's what I think.
Yeah. Brilliant. So thank you very much. And although I said we were going to do all the answers at the end, I wonder if we should go to one question before we shift to the book club panel part, which is we've got one question from the audience. I hope it's going to go up on the banner in a moment. But it's, I am a 50-year-old MA graduate and social researcher who wants to get into publishing. Am I too old to enter the profession? Creative Queen. So who wants to jump in on that first? Margaret, you're shaking your head. Do you want to jump in?
Well, I don't think anybody's too old to do anything. I mean, one of the oldest, in fact, the oldest first novelist I published was 84. So I think, although the industry may have all sorts of barriers that make it seem that the only people involved are a certain age group, I don't see why that should be. That's one of the challenges we have to deal with in terms of the industry's profile. We don't want it to be only people of a certain age or below a certain age who can take part. So I would think it may be difficult to find your way into it, but it shouldn't be if you're 50 or over, because you're bringing a perspective that's necessary. And I think publishing, the industry should recognize that. It's not just of interest to people of a certain age group or any sort of demographic. It could be applicable to any person who's interested in getting involved.
Brilliant. And to take a slightly different angle on it, I think let's go to Farhana and then Kimberly on some of the challenges that might be faced. Practical challenges. What do you think is the biggest challenge if you're determined to publish? What for you, Farhana, would be your top tip?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably easier to get into the profession now than it probably ever was, and that's because you can build your networks. So, overcome, if you have any sort of tech phobia, overcoming that would be great. But like Margaret says, I also believe that you're never too old to do anything you want. So go for it.
Brilliant. And how about you, Kimberly? Top tips?
I'd say, like Farhana just said, it's about, they say getting the followers as well, because if you want to be traditionally published, they say, oh, do you have the followers and, do you have that engagement? But also it's about the distractions for audiences from other activities, I think. So you can play games or you can go on websites. And a lot of people have said to me, I don't read, but they read websites and they read comments on YouTube. So they just don't read books. So that there is that distraction. But I think, I think go for it. And we need those voices out there. We need that, as Margaret said, the perspective. So that's what I'd say for her.
So some fascinating insights into publishing past and present and thoughts about the future of publishing. Thanks so much to our distinguished panel and thank you for joining us.